Good afternoon, class. Welcome to this week's lecture on History 210, America's Western Frontier. This week we are moving on to Module 7, the Indian Wars, and are going to look explicitly at the Fetterman fight. The main theme or central point of this week's lecture is that the December 1866 defeat of Captain Fetterman and his relief task force in the immediate vicinity of Fort Phil Kearny in what is now the state of Wyoming was at the time the most significant defeat for the United States Army at the hands of the Northern Plains American Indian tribes, and would result in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which ended Red Cloud's War and, for the time being, represented the most significant victory for the American Indian tribes over the United States Army. I am sure each and every one of you read all six readings associated with this week's lecture, consisting of 4 primary sources and 2 secondary sources. We have 3 points of emphasis or discussion associated with this week's lecture. We will briefly examine the period between the 6th December skirmish and, of course, the eventual Fetterman fight of 21 December, with a focus on the relationship between Colonel Carrington and Captain Fetterman and the latter's supposed view of American Indian martial capabilities or lack thereof. Secondly, we will, of course, look at the fight itself, which occurred on 21 December. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, if not most interestingly, the aftermath, in which Captain Fetterman becomes the focal point or single point of failure in the eventual outcome associated with the fight. Really, that is that you could say he becomes the antagonist in this event, the one who is unquestionably responsible for the deaths of all of his men, a characterization that, rightly or wrongly, you shall be the judge based upon historical examination, of course. A characterization that has, again, essentially almost without question, held true in the intervening years. So, Colonel Henry Carrington entered what is now Wyoming in 1866 with the order to erect fortifications in the Powder River region, that is the northern region, north central region of what is now Wyoming, for the purpose of protecting caravans traveling the Bozeman Trail across the wilds of Wyoming territory into the gold fields of Montana, and where you were, of course, going to strike it rich and live a life of luxury here on ever after. Interestingly enough, there was an attempt by the government in the summer of 1866 to secure travel rights across the Wyoming territory by treaty with the Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne, alas, to no avail. As a result of these failed negotiations, the tribes, in the personification or led by the Sioux war leader Red Cloud, therefore made it known to the United States Army and government that they were going to protect their sacred lands, and they were going to do so at all cost. That being said, Colonel Carrington, despite personal misgivings, is directed to proceed with his mission, and as a dutiful soldier, does so. He moves on into the Powder River region and establishes 3 forts. In the fall of 1866, Captain Fetterman, who was not part of Colonel Carrington's original party, would join him at Fort Phil Kearny as the Army looked to expand its presence in the region. Now, moving on to an examination of the relationship between Carrington and Fetterman, there's circumstantial evidence that this relationship was not exactly a warm and cordial one, but a rather cool and professional one. These men actually had known each other going back to the start of the Civil War. And here we can ask ourselves the question, if you will, is it possible that Carrington was somewhat intimidated by Fetterman's record, considering that he, that being Carrington, had spent the Civil War not on the battlefield as had Fetterman, but in fact had spent it as an administrator behind a desk. Now, we of course can't be certain that this played any role here. However, the idea cannot simply be dismissed out of hand. Fetterman would actually, during the Civil War, spend the war on the battlefield and would compile a rather exemplary record. So, in the years following Fetterman's demise, Colonel Carrington's first wife, in her account of this time and event, would make the unverified assertion that Fetterman displayed an overt and boisterous contempt for the fighting capabilities of the Plains Indians by pronouncing that with company or regiment-sized elements of the United States Army, 1,000 at least, and at most, all hostile Indians could be eliminated. Interestingly enough, Colonel Carrington himself did not include any such quotations or statements attributed to Fetterman in his official report of the fight of the 21st. Now, there may be other reasons why he may not have included such statements from Fetterman. However, the record is that there is no such reference to Fetterman making such a claim prior to Mrs. Carrington's account, and that simply cannot be ignored. Now, on the afternoon of 6 December, the Fort's Wood train was attacked by a combined war party consisting of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoes, an attack that both Fetterman and Carrington took part in as members of the command's relief or reactionary task force. While attempting to repel the attack, reckless actions on behalf of two junior officers resulted in the death of one of them and the narrow escape of the cavalry commander, a certain Lieutenant George Grumman, an officer that we shall encounter again. As a result of this action, Carrington does include in his report, for what it's worth, that Fetterman now voiced respect for Indian fighting capabilities and also proceeded to pronounce that caution was definitely required for all activities outside the relative safety of Fort Kearny's walls. With this background established, we can now move forward on to the events of 21 December. So, turning again to Red Cloud, his lieutenants and their warriors, now, and not that it really matters in the larger picture, but just to kind of give you an idea of scope and scale, 1,000 is kind of the number that's generally used as the baseline for the number of Indian warriors that were in the immediate vicinity of Fort Phil Kearny on 21 December. And that's a rather significant force. And, of course, their intention that day was yet again to deliver to the United States Army another significant blow. And in that tension, they were extremely successful. The post wood train, again, as it normally did, set out for the piney woods. And, of course, their purpose was to fell trees in order to supply the garrison with its needed supply of lumber. By late morning, according to participating Indian accounts, warriors had taken their places, and that began with those who were assigned the responsibility to act as decoys. And their intention, of course, was to hopefully draw out yet another relief force from the fort and leading it into an ambush or attack. So they attacked the wood train, the Indian warriors did. Carrington hears this, or is given this report. He then gives the order to assemble a relief force, and Fetterman, being the second highest ranking officer at Fort Phil Kearny, requested permission to lead it. Carrington acquiesces. However, he gives Fetterman, or reportedly gives Fetterman, the explicit orders that he is not to proceed past the ridge of, or crest of Lodge Trail Ridge, because in doing so, he would be out of sight of the fort And of course, visual communications is very important in these days, and that is how commanders are able to kind of maintain situational awareness of what's going on with their command. Lieutenant Grumman, our friend from 6 December, sought and received permission to accompany Fetterman with a detachment of cavalry, to which this request Carrington also acquiesced. And finally, also seeking to join the relief party were 2 civilians, bringing the total number of Fetterman's relief force to 80 men in all. The relief party departed Fort Phil Kearny and headed in the direction of the Piney Forest, and initially, and in apparent adherence to his orders, halted at the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge. And then, for reasons that we shall never know and that are lost to history, Fetterman and party pushed on beyond the crest and down into the valley, and you might say into immortality or infamy, depending on your outlook. Moving forward, at this point, we hereafter have to rely on Indian accounts, and they recount that Fetterman and the infantry moved smartly and maintained good order and discipline as they were surrounded and ultimately decimated in total. Now, what you can't overlook here, and looking at this from a military officer perspective, that when they characterize Fetterman and his men as moving smartly and in good order, that does not illustrate or display men that are being brazen or reckless in how they're going about their business, if you will. So again, we're not seeing from the Indian accounts any sort of illustration or actions on the behalf of Fetterman specifically that align with the characterization that would come to really define him. While Fetterman reportedly is conducting himself in a rather professional way, Grumman, as he did on 6 December, gave the cavalry the order to charge, and they would do so up the valley a ways. However, like Fetterman and the infantry, Grumman and his small cavalry detachment were likewise completely annihilated as well. Carrington, of course, now that he had lost sight of Fetterman and the relief party, became concerned as he can hear increasing amounts of gunfire and Indian war whoops. He dispatches yet another relief force, and this relief force really kind of meanders and takes its time working its way up Trail Lodge Ridge and so forth. And in fact, there's a whole other story associated with the second relief party that one could get into, but we of course don't have time here today, so we're just not going to get into that. Safe to know that it's Captain Tenek and the second relief party that discovers Captain Fetterman and the remains of all his men, and it is included in Carrington's report that each and every body without exception was found to be mutilated. News of the disastrous encounter shocked the nation, and again, it would be the most disastrous outcome experienced by the United States Army at the hands of American Indian Wars until the much more famous General Custer decimation at Little Bighorn a decade later. Colonel Carrington, as a result of this, was immediately recalled by the War Department in the fight, and his role were the subject of 2 official investigations. Carrington, as a result of these investigations, was deemed not directly culpable and would actually attain rank, flag officer rank or general officer rank. However, the stain of this disaster would remain with him hereafter. He would not really achieve any level of prominence, if you will, in the Army. For Red Cloud and the Plains Indian tribes, the fight would continue and finally allow them to secure considerations from the U.S. government, which included the abandonment of Carrington's 3 garrisons that he had established in Wyoming Territory, Of course, the American Indians' victory was short-lived, as subsequent discovery of gold in the Black Hills region of what is now South Dakota, again a region which is contingent to the Powder River region, resulted in yet another significant wave of prospectors, ranchers, farmers, and ultimately settlers. For Captain Fetterman, he would in memory be convicted, essentially, in the court of history, as the one who primarily owned responsibility for the debacle, primarily established on a characterization of him being brazen and spiteful towards American Indians' ability to engage the United States Army in combat. Yet, this characterization, while it may fit the contemporary conventional view believed to be that of Americans of European descent by and large, it cannot definitively be corroborated. Again, the first account relating this attitude was made or published in 1879, 13 years after the event, and on the heel of Custer's defeat and death at Little Bighorn. It must be remembered that such a characterization is also attributed to General Custer, and therefore the timing of this requires further contemplation. Furthermore, subsequent secondary narratives associated with this event without fail utilize as their source Mrs. Carrington's account, an account that does not in and of itself provide corroborating evidence or additional primary accounts from which her narrative is constructed. Colonel Carrington's second wife, who interestingly enough was also present at Fort Phil Kearny at the time of the Fettermam massacre, as she was then married to Lieutenant Grumman, would go on to write and publish her own account of this time period and event in the early 20th century, and she too would also use the first Mrs. Carrington's account as her source in her characterization of Fetterman as well. In concluding this week, the Powder River excursion and Fetterman fight in many ways represent a microcosm of the experience between American Indians and those of European descent as the clash of cultures that had characterized the earliest days of European settlement and persistent migration west. And of course, it really was elevated in America's western frontier. What we can examine in relation to the Fetterman fight exclusively is that the American Indian was in fact a keen and worthwhile foe for the United States Army, and not some wild savage incapable of complex battle plans. It also reminds us that they did have success in their unceasing effort to maintain their sacred lands. Alas, for them it was a temporary victory, as we know that settlement would resume and ultimately succeed, but perhaps most importantly as it relates to an American Indian, is that we need to remember that the American Indians' role and contributions to the mosaic that is the American story was and is one of a leading role, and not that of simply being a backdrop in what is an otherwise exciting period of frontier settlement. On the other side, we can see the danger associated with primary source reliability and the need to always seek corroboration in historical analysis. Fetterman has and continues to be viewed as a hot-headed officer whose reckless attitude led to the likewise reckless decisions resulting in his and his men's destruction that December day in 1866. But just as with Custer a decade later, it is more likely than not that the conventionally held conclusion is not so simple and not so neat. Therefore, for the historian and the student, it is best to maintain what we might specify as an open mind through exhaustive research and allow the empirical evidence to lead you down the path to what we hope is the closest we can come to the truth. Thank you, and have a good week.